Today I'm going to show you my DJI Osmo Action for settings and workflow for achieving cinematic results, similar to what you saw at the beginning of this video. Starting with the settings, in terms of resolution, I always shoot in 4K for the best image quality. As for the frame rate, I shoot at either 25, 50 or 100 frames per second. If I want a super slow motion shot, I'll set it to 100p. If I don't want any slow motion at all, I'll set it to 25p. And if I want something in between, then I'll set it to 50p. For the best stabilization performance, I use HorizonSteady Plus. It does crop a bit more than normal HorizonSteady, but it delivers better results. You also have the option to record gyro data with the Action 4 and stabilize the clips manually in post-production. Some say it gives better results, but I personally prefer to stabilize everything in camera. I think the HorizonSteady stabilization is more than good enough, and it saves me a lot of time rather than importing all the clips to my computer, opening up a gyro flow and then stabilizing every single clip manually. Next, in the image adjustment menu, I set the noise reduction to -1 and sharpness to -2. From the test I've done, setting the noise reduction to -1 delivers the most optimal results. At -2, the image looks too grainy, and at +1, it looks unnatural. As for the sharpness, I prefer to add sharpness myself in post-production. However, if you don't want to do that, you can set it to 0 in camera. It works fine as well. Next, for the most part, I use the standard D-warp field of view, unless I'm shooting action sports, in which case I'll switch to ultra wide. As for the color, I shoot everything in D-log M. It provides the widest dynamic range and the most natural looking colors out of the Action 4. As for the white balance, I always try to adjust it manually as much as I can. However, in some situations I set it to automatic. For example, if I'm doing action sports where I can't really predict anything, but for the most part I adjust it manually to get the most accurate colors. Now, if you don't know how to properly set the white balance, the Action 4 has a feature where you can lock it by setting it to automatic, waiting for a few seconds and then switching back to manual. This is not the most accurate way to do it. I would suggest learning Kelvin values, etc., but it works much better than using automatic white balance where the colors shift all over the place. Moving on to exposure, for the most part I manually expose all of my shots. This takes more time and effort than letting the camera adjust the exposure automatically, but it provides the best results. Here are my manual exposure settings and workflow. I usually leave the ISO at 100 to minimize noise in the image. However, if I need to increase the ISO to achieve proper exposure, I won't hesitate to bump it up a little bit. I usually don't go above ISO 800, but the ISO performance on this camera is fantastic. Then I put on one of my freewheel ND filters. I choose the strength depending on the scene. If it's really bright, I use ND32 or ND64, but if it's a bit darker, I usually use ND8 or ND16. Finally, to set the proper exposure, I adjust the shutter speed until the EV icon in the top left corner of the screen is roughly at +0.0 when the scene is very bright, like a landscape for example, and -0.7 if the scene is more contrasty with equal amounts of shadows and highlights. Let me show you a couple of examples. Let's start by exposing for this landscape shot, which is the easiest one to expose for because there is no high contrast between highlights and shadows. All right, first of all, let's adjust the white balance. At the moment it's daylight, so I'm going to set it to 5500 Kelvin. Then I'm going to go to the exposure menu, adjust it to the manual settings, and I'm going to lower the ISO to 100 to get the least amount of noise in the image. And by the way, I also have an ND8 in the front just to reduce the exposure slightly. And I'm going to adjust the shutter speed until the EV compensation is set to +0.0. -0.3. It's better to overexpose slightly, so +0.3 will work for this situation. And the exposure should be pretty much perfect. Now, one important thing I want to mention is to not go below 1/200 shutter speed if you want optimal stabilization performance on any action camera. That means Action 4, GoPro camera or Insta360 cameras, because they all rely on high shutter speeds for the best performance. If you want to go to 1/50 to achieve more natural looking motion blur, you would have to use a gimbal for the best stabilization performance. Now, if I'm shooting in a situation like this where there's a high contrast between shadows and highlights, I expose a bit differently. So let me show you how I do it. First, let's adjust the white balance. I think I'm going to leave it at 5500 Kelvin because it's daylight outside and I'm exposing for the highlights in this case. And let's adjust the exposure. I'm going to set the ISO to 100 and I'm going to adjust the shutter speed until the EV compensation says roughly minus 0.7. So now it's minus 0.3. I would say somewhere around here looks just fine. This is minus 0.7 EV exposure on the Action 4. Now, if I had a subject in this scene, like you're seeing right now, my girlfriend is in the shot, I would expose a bit differently because I would like to see some details of her. So I'm gonna go to the exposure and I'm gonna bring up the shutter speed to about here, minus 0.3, so I can still not completely crush the highlights, but see some details in the shadows. This is how it looks like. Now, in some cases, like when I'm vlogging, I actually completely expose for the shadows because I don't want to be dark. So let me show you how this looks like. A bit more, a bit more. My girlfriend is adjusting the shutter speed for me. A bit more. And I'm completely relying on the front screen right now to judge the exposure. And I think that's it. This looks good. The highlights are completely blown out, but it's not as important as having myself properly exposed. In some cases, I don't have the time to manually adjust my exposure, like when I'm vlogging. In these situations, I use automatic exposure with these settings. ISO 100-400 in bright conditions. If it's a bit dark, I'll switch to ISO 100-800, and in some cases, even ISO 100-1600. Then I set the EV to plus 0.0 and the shutter speed to 1/200 to 1/8000 to get the best stabilization results. Now, to quickly switch between automatic and manual exposure modes, you can create custom presets on the Action 4. I have 3 of them at the moment. The first one is my manual exposure preset and it's set to 5500 Kelvin white balance, ISO 100 and a shutter speed of 1/400 as a starting point. The second one is my auto exposure preset with ISO 100-400, shutter speed 1/200, 1/8000 and auto white balance. The third one is the same as the second one but with the ISO set to 1600. I also have my snapshot setting set to my second auto exposure preset, which allows me to quickly start recording with my custom settings when the camera is off just by pressing the record button. I use this feature a lot, especially when I'm vlogging and I need to capture something really quickly. I can just press the record button, it's going to turn on and start recording. And if I want to stop, I just press it again and that's it. Finally, to color correct my Action 4 footage, I use Final Cut Pro and I add a slight amount of contrast and saturation with color board. Then I adjust the white balance with color curves and add sharpness as needed because I reduced it in camera. I do this to all of my Action 4 clips, and then of course I color grade each clip individually to add an artistic touch and make the footage look better. I have a video here where I show you how I color grade Action 4 footage, and you can download my free Action 4 D-Log MLOT down below. Thanks for watching.